Kevin was just a boy when his life changed forever. Since losing his parents in a tragic car accident, he had taken on the responsibility of looking after his younger brother Tommy, who was physically disabled. The two brothers lived alone in a small rented house on the outskirts of a city in the United States. Kevin, determined and resilient, refused to accept that their fate would be marked by eternal hardship. He worked as a shoeshine boy in the busy streets of the city center. Every shoe he polished was another step towards keeping a roof over their heads and ensuring they had enough to eat at the end of the day. The customers, usually hurried businessmen, hardly ever looked him in the eye. To them, Kevin was just a boy in plain clothes who looked after their worn-out shoes. But for Kevin, every polish had a greater meaning. "Today's going to be better, Tommy," he would say every morning as he left the house, leaving his brother at home in the care of their elderly neighbor, Mrs. Martha, who had become a kind of protector for the two boys. The woman, despite her poor health and financial limitations, was a constant figure of support. On one of those sunny mornings, Kevin was on his usual street corner, preparing his shoeshine kit, when a customer approached. The man in the gray suit stopped, looked at his own shoes and said, without enthusiasm, "Quick polish, kid. I've got a meeting in 10 minutes. Kevin, used to the hurried tone of businessmen, nodded silently and began his work. While he was wiping his leather shoes, the man looked at Kevin's slight figure and commented, "Shouldn't you be at school, boy?" Without losing his composure, Kevin replied, "I have to work to look after my brother. School can wait." The man shook his head, puzzled, but didn't ask any more questions. Kevin knew that most people didn't understand his situation. He was used to being invisible to many, but he never complained. He did what was necessary to survive, and that included sacrificing his own dreams. When the customer left, Kevin took the few coins he had received and put them in his pocket with a sigh. The sun was starting to warm up the asphalt, and he knew he had hours to go before he had to get home. At this rate, there was no time for regrets. "It's going to be okay," he muttered to himself, as if words had the power to transform his reality. Around midday, Kevin felt his stomach rumble. He looked at the busy street, full of people coming and going. His thoughts always turned to Tommy. Every step he took was for him. Every coin he received was to ensure his brother's comfort. Tommy, despite his physical limitations, was the reason Kevin kept fighting. Throughout the day, Kevin shined his shoes, one after the other, faster and faster, to get some extra money. When the sun was about to set, he finally packed his things and returned home, tired but lighthearted. He knew Tommy would be waiting, and that was all that mattered. When he arrived home, he was greeted by the fragile smile of Mrs. Martha, who was sitting in a chair by the window. "You're strong, Kevin," she said quietly, watching the young man as he took off his shoes and went straight to his brother. Tommy, sitting in his wheelchair, smiled as he saw Kevin enter. "How was your day, Kev?" he asked, always curious but concerned about the effort his brother was making for him. Kevin bent down beside his brother and put his hand on his shoulder. "It was tiring, but I got a bit more money today, so I'll be able to buy that thing you like." "What's it called again?" Tommy smiled, but didn't answer, knowing that Kevin was just trying to keep his spirits up. His older brother always did his best to hide his tiredness and frustration. The truth was that Kevin carried the weight of a much greater responsibility than he should have for his age. Before going to sleep, Kevin sat next to Tommy's bed, as he did every night. "I promise that one day things will change," he said quietly. "I'm going to give you a better life, Tommy. You'll see." These words, although spoken every night, had a deep meaning for Kevin. He didn't know how or when, but he believed with all his heart that, at some point, something would change for them. And until then, he would do his best to ensure that Tommy lived with as much dignity and happiness as he could provide. Kevin laid down on his own bed and, before closing his eyes, looked out of the window. The moon shone in the sky, as a reminder that even on the darkest nights, there would always be light. Kevin and Tommy's lives took an unexpected turn after the accident that took their parents' lives. They were children at the time, with no understanding of how the world worked. The fear of being separated and sent to the orphanage always haunted Kevin. With the death of their parents, the two brothers were at the mercy of fate, and it seemed that the future would be even bleaker. But in the midst of this deep pain, a light appeared in the form of Mrs. Martha. She was an elderly neighbor and close friend of the family. In the last years of Kevin and Tommy's mother's life, she had become a mother figure to them. Even before the accident, Mrs. Martha had been helping to look after the children while their parents were at work. When the tragic accident happened, she was the first person to rush to the boys' house, with tears in her eyes and a tightness in her heart, knowing what this meant for the boys. That day, after the funeral, Kevin was sitting on the sofa in the small living room, holding Tommy's hand, while Mrs. Martha prepared tea in the kitchen. The two boys were silent, not knowing what was going to happen next. Kevin, despite his young age, knew it would be difficult. The sound of the kettle interrupted his thoughts. "Come here, boys," said Mrs. Martha's soft voice from the kitchen. "Let's talk." Kevin looked at Tommy, who seemed even more dejected, and helped him up from his chair. Together, they walked to the small kitchen table, where Mrs. Martha had placed 3 cups of hot tea. She watched them for a moment, looking sad but determined. "Before your mother left, she asked me something very important," she began, her voice breaking. "She asked me to take care of you, to make sure you stayed together and away from the orphanage." Kevin looked at her, surprised, but said nothing. He just squeezed Tommy's hand tighter, as if he was already preparing to fight whatever came next. "I know I don't have much," continued Mrs. Martha, trying to hold back tears. "My health isn't what it used to be, and money is tight, but I promised your mother I'd do my best. You're both going to stay with me, and we'll do our best to move on. You won't split up, that's for sure." Tommy, who had remained silent until then, finally spoke. "Do you think it will work out, Kev?" His voice was low, almost a whisper, full of uncertainty. Kevin looked at his brother, his eyes fixed on his. "It'll work out, Tommy. We have Mrs. Martha. We'll be together, and I'm going to take care of you, no matter what." Mrs. Martha smiled at them both, discreetly wiping away a tear that had fallen down her cheek. "You have each other, and you have me. That's what matters now." And so began the two brothers' new reality. Mrs. Martha's small house, with its constant smell of homemade bread and tea, became a refuge for Kevin and Tommy. They knew life wouldn't be easy, but at least they had each other. In the months that followed, Mrs. Martha, even with her fragile health and limited resources, kept her promise. The morning started early. Mrs. Martha would wake the boys up for breakfast, a simple plate of porridge or bread and butter, and then Kevin would leave for his job as a shoeshine boy, while Tommy was left in the care of the neighbor. When Kevin returned home at the end of the day, the house was always illuminated by a soft light, and the comforting aroma of something cooking welcomed them. "You're taking good care of Tommy, Kevin," Mrs. Martha would often say, with an encouraging smile. "And he knows it. He knows he can count on you." Kevin nodded silently, trying to hide his fatigue from a full day's work. He never complained, never let his frustrations show. For him, every little sacrifice was worth it if it meant keeping Tommy happy and healthy. Their bond grew stronger every day. Although Kevin had to give up many things, including school, to work and support the household, he never wavered in his responsibilities. He knew that the only thing that mattered was keeping Tommy close and making sure they were never separated. On a cold winter's evening, Mrs. Martha was sitting in the rocking chair, knitting something for the boys. Kevin was standing by the window, looking out as he usually did, thinking about the future. He didn't know how, but he felt that things would have to change. He didn't want Tommy to be dependent on Mrs. Martha's goodwill forever. She had already done so much for them. "Martha," he began, turning to the old woman, "you've already done so much for us. One day, I promise I'll find a way to look after Tommy on my own. I'll make sure he has everything he needs." She smiled, without lifting her eyes from her knitting. "You already do that, Kevin. Every day you go out to work, you're looking after him in a way that many adults couldn't." Kevin sighed, feeling the weight of responsibility on his back. He knew that, as grateful as he was, there was still a lot to do. Tommy's health needed medical care that he couldn't afford, and as much as Mrs. Martha was an invaluable help, he knew that her time was also limited. But at that moment, they had each other, and that was already more than many had. Kevin knew that, as long as there was love and determination, they could face anything. Mornings at Kevin and Tommy's house followed a rhythm of their own, marked by simplicity and small gestures of care. Mrs. Martha, with her frail hands, did her best to keep the house tidy and provide what she could with her little money. Kevin, for his part, was always in a hurry, but never failed to take one last look at Tommy before leaving for work. His younger brother, limited by his wheelchair, always tried to stay positive despite his condition. One of these mornings began like so many others. Kevin was tidying up his shoe shine box, while Tommy watched him from the kitchen table, where Mrs. Martha was pouring warm tea. Steam rose slowly from the cups, and soft sunlight illuminated the simple but cozy atmosphere. "Is today going to be another hard day?" asked Tommy with a forced smile. He knew that Kevin never complained, but the marks of tiredness were always present on his face. Kevin looked at his brother with a half smile. "Difficult? No, just another day like any other. Nothing I can't handle," he replied, trying to look nonchalant as he tied the laces of his worn-out shoes. Tommy, however, knew his brother better than anyone. He knew that Kevin was facing a lot more than he was saying. "You always make it sound so easy, but I know how hard you work, Kev." Kevin stopped for a moment and approached his brother, bending down beside him. "Tommy, I do it 1,000 times over without thinking twice. Don't worry about it. I promised I'd look after you, and that's what I'm going to do until we get something better." Tommy sighed, looking down at the floor. "Sometimes I just wish I could help more. I feel like I'm a burden to you and Mrs. Martha." Kevin shook his head firmly. "You never were and never will be a burden, Tommy. We're a team, we always have been. You help me more than you know." At that moment, Mrs. Martha, who was listening to the conversation from the kitchen, approached with her slow gait and placed her trembling hands on Kevin and Tommy's shoulders. "You two are stronger than you think. As long as you're together, nothing will bring you down. And as for me, looking after you gives me a reason to go on." Kevin smiled at her, grateful for those words. Even with their limitations, Mrs. Martha was the anchor that held them together. Knowing he didn't have much time before starting his job on the streets, he grabbed his shoe shine box and got ready to leave. Before he walked through the door, Tommy called out, "Kev, just be careful, okay? And come back soon." "I'll be back before you know it," replied Kevin, winking at his brother and closing the door behind him. The city streets were busy as usual. Cars rushing by, people walking with their eyes fixed on their cell phones, preoccupied with their own problems. For Kevin, it was all part of the routine, finding a good spot to shine shoes and making sure he got enough to buy the necessities for the house. He knew that this job wouldn't bring him great riches, but it was what he had to support Tommy and keep the little family together. The day progressed slowly, and Kevin had already shined a dozen pairs of shoes. Businessmen passed by and didn't even look at him. He was invisible, a poor boy in the midst of the luxury of the people who frequented the busy streets. But that didn't matter to Kevin. Every coin he received brought him closer to his goal, giving Tommy a better life. Throughout the day, as Kevin struggled to earn some money, his thoughts often returned home. He knew that, although Mrs. Martha was taking good care of Tommy, his brother's condition was getting worse over time. His wheelchair was already old, and the medical treatments he needed were beyond what they could afford. Kevin tried not to let himself get down, but it was difficult. "I have to find a way to change this," he muttered to himself as he polished another shoe. "Tommy deserves more than this, much more." One of the customers, who was waiting for his shoe to be polished, looked at him curiously. "Say something, kid?" Kevin shook his head quickly, trying to disguise it. "Nothing, sir. Just thinking out loud." The man shook his head and went back to fiddling with his cell phone without further questioning. Kevin finished his work and took the small amount of money the man gave him. It wasn't much, but it was what he expected. When the day finally ended and the sun began to set, Kevin returned home, tired but with the satisfaction of having done what he could. As he opened the door, the familiar smell of home-cooked food greeted him, along with Mrs. Martha's kind smile. "How was your day, Kevin?" she asked as she placed a simple plate on the table. "It was good. I got a bit more today. Maybe soon we'll be able to replace Tommy's wheelchair," he replied, trying to sound positive, even if he knew they were still a long way off. Tommy, sitting by the table, looked at his brother with a glint of hope in his eyes. "Do you think you'll make it, Kev?" Kevin walked over to his brother and put his hand on his shoulder. "I know I will, Tommy. It may not be tomorrow, but we'll get there." Mrs. Martha sat down with them at the table, and for a brief moment, the weight of the difficulties seemed less overwhelming. Together, they shared a simple meal, but one filled with love and hope. It was an ordinary afternoon in Kevin's life. He was sitting in his usual corner of the main street, polishing the shoes of one of the many businessmen who passed by every day. The sun was strong, and the scorching heat made the work even more exhausting. The constant sound of cars, horns, and voices mixed together, creating a chaotic symphony that he had learned to ignore. For Kevin, this was just another day of hard work. While he was concentrating on polishing the leather shoes in front of him, something caught his eye from across the street. A girl, distracted by her cell phone, was hurrying towards the crosswalk. Kevin watched her for a few seconds, noticing that she wasn't paying attention to anything around her. Suddenly, he saw the danger. A car was coming at high speed, and the girl didn't seem to realize how close she was to being run over. Without a second thought, Kevin dropped everything he was doing and ran towards the street. "Look out," he shouted, but the girl, still immersed in her cell phone screen, didn't hear. Time seemed to slow down. Kevin, his heart racing, managed to catch up with her at the last second, grabbing her arm and pulling her back out of the car's way. The vehicle sped past, honking its horn, without even stopping to check if anyone had been hurt. The girl, visibly stunned, looked at Kevin with wide eyes. I didn't see the car. I could have died," she stammered, still in shock. Kevin, panting, slowly let go of her arm, relieved to have saved her. "You need to pay more attention," he said in a firm but gentle voice. "These drivers don't always respect the lane." The girl, finally pulling herself together, looked Kevin up and down. He was still wearing his simple clothes and a grease-stained apron. She tried to straighten her own hair, clearly embarrassed. "Thank you, really. I don't know what would have happened if you hadn't been here." Kevin shrugged, not wanting to make a big deal out of it. "I just did what anyone would do." She hesitated for a moment before finally asking, "What's your name?" "Kevin," he replied. "And yours?" "Emma," she said with a small smile. "My dad, he'll want to thank you for that." Kevin didn't seem very interested in receiving any thanks. He was already thinking about going back to his work, worried about the time he'd lost. "You don't have to. Just be more careful next time." But Emma insisted. "Really, my father is very grateful when someone does something like this. He can reward you. You saved me." Before Kevin could refuse again, a luxurious black car pulled up at the curb, and the driver opened the door for Emma. She gave Kevin one last look. "Meet me here tomorrow. I want you to meet my father." Kevin just nodded, non-committally, and returned to his post. The incident seemed surreal to him, but there wasn't much time to think about it. The businessman whose shoe he had been polishing before the incident now looked at him impatiently. "Are you going to finish or not?" the customer asked, irritated by the interruption. Kevin quickly got back to work, but his thoughts were still on what had just happened. He wasn't used to dealing with people like Emma, let alone someone who came from such a different background. She was clearly rich, and the fact that she had mentioned reward made Kevin uncomfortable. That wasn't what he wanted or expected. Arriving home that evening, Kevin was tired, but the sight of Tommy and Mrs. Martha made him smile. Tommy, as usual, was at the table, fiddling with an old book his neighbor had given him. "Hi, Kev. How was your day?" asked Tommy, always interested in his brother's routine. Kevin approached and playfully ruffled Tommy's hair. It was the same as always, but something different happened today. Mrs. Martha, who was preparing dinner in the kitchen, overheard the conversation and approached with curiosity. How different? Kevin then told them about the incident with Emma and how he had prevented her from being run over. "She said her father wanted to pay me back, but I don't think it's necessary." Tommy, his eyes shining, looked excited. "Kev, maybe this is a chance. What if her father is someone who can help you? Help us?" Kevin shook his head. "I don't know, Tommy. These rich people live in another world. I don't think her father will want to do more than give her some money, and I don't want that. I just did what anyone would do." Mrs. Martha, always wise, intervened. "Sometimes, Kevin, life gives us opportunities in unexpected ways. Don't close yourself off to help when it comes. Maybe this meeting with the girl's father will bring something good for all of you." Kevin was thoughtful, but didn't say anything else. He wasn't used to receiving anything from anyone, let alone rich strangers. However, he knew that the situation at home was becoming increasingly difficult. Tommy's treatment was expensive, and no matter how hard he worked, he couldn't get enough money together. Perhaps, as Mrs. Martha had said, this was an opportunity. The next day, Kevin returned to the same place as always, and it wasn't long before he saw the black car parked again. Emma got out of the vehicle with a smile and greeted him with a wave. "I told you I'd be back. My dad wants to meet you. Are you ready?" Kevin took a deep breath. He wasn't sure what to expect, but something inside him told him that this could be the chance to change Tommy's life. "Let's go," he replied with a slight nod. And so Kevin prepared himself for what could be the start of an unexpected change in his life. The next day, Kevin returned to the same spot as always, still reflecting on his meeting with Emma. He knew that people of his status rarely crossed the path of the rich, and when they did, it wasn't usually anything significant. But there was something about Emma that made him believe that this time it could be different. In the late afternoon, when Kevin had almost finished his work, the black car he already knew pulled up on the corner. Emma got out first, waving at him. Next to her, an imposing older man wearing an expensive suit got out of the vehicle. His eyes roamed the street with a mixture of curiosity and caution. "Kevin, this is my father, Richard," said Emma, smiling and trying to break the ice. "He really wanted to thank you in person." Kevin, a little nervous, wiped his hands on his apron and approached. "Sir," he began with a respectful nod. Richard watched the young man for a moment before speaking. "So, you're the boy who saved my daughter." His voice was grave, but not hostile. "I owe you a lot." Kevin shook his head, uncomfortable with the weight of gratitude. "I only did what anyone would do, sir. No need to thank me." Richard narrowed his eyes, as if studying Kevin more closely. "Maybe, but most people wouldn't have reacted so quickly. And so, I'd like to return the favor." Before Kevin could reply, Richard took a leather wallet out of his pocket and began counting out a considerable amount of money. He extended his hand towards Kevin, offering the wad of cash. "Here, take this. It's the least I can do to thank you for saving my daughter's life." Kevin looked at the money surprised. It wasn't what he had expected. Sure, the money would be useful. He could pay some of Tommy's medical bills, maybe buy a new wheelchair. But something inside him prevented him from accepting it. It wasn't just about the money. I can't accept that," said Kevin in a firm but polite voice. "I didn't do it for a reward. I just did what anyone should do." Richard frowned, surprised by the refusal. He wasn't used to someone rejecting his money. "It's a fair amount, lad. You could do what you like with it." Kevin took a deep breath and looked directly into Richard's eyes. "I appreciate that, sir, but it's not what I need." Emma, who was watching the conversation, sensed that something deeper was going on. "Dad, maybe we should hear what he has to say." Richard looked at his daughter and then turned his attention to Kevin. "All right, kid, what do you want then?" Kevin hesitated for a moment, but knew this was his chance. "My brother, Tommy, he has a physical condition that prevents him from walking. He needs treatment, something we can't afford. If I can ask you for something, I'd like you to meet him. That's all." Richard was silent for a few seconds, clearly surprised by the humility and sincerity of the request. "You're asking me to meet your brother instead of taking the money?" Kevin nodded. "Yes, sir. Tommy is everything to me. If there's one thing I really want, it's to see him get the help he needs." Richard seemed to reflect on this, glancing at Emma, who gave a small smile, encouraging her father. After a long silence, Richard finally spoke. "Very well. I'm going to meet your brother." Kevin smiled with relief, something he rarely did. "Thank you, sir. You won't regret it." That evening, Kevin returned home with a mixture of nervousness and hope. He had never imagined that a man as powerful as Richard would be willing to meet Tommy and perhaps help them. When he opened the door, he was greeted by Tommy, who was as usual, sitting at the table with Mrs. Martha by his side. "Hi, Kev," exclaimed Tommy. "How was your day today? Any more shine shoes?" Kevin smiled and pulled up a chair, taking a seat next to his brother. "It was different today, Tommy. Remember the girl I told you about, the one who almost got run over? Her father came to thank me." Tommy, intrigued, leaned forward a little. "Really? What did he say?" Kevin took a deep breath. "He offered me money, but I refused." Tommy's eyes widened in surprise. "You refused? Why?" Kevin put his hand on his brother's shoulder. Because I asked for something better. I asked him to come and meet you. Mrs. Martha, who had been quiet until then, looked at Kevin with approval in her eyes. You do the right thing, Kevin. Sometimes the best opportunities come from gestures like that. Tommy, still processing the information, finally smiled. Do you think he'll help me? Kevin nodded. I think he will. He seems to be a man of his word. Tomorrow he'll come here, and maybe this will be the start of something new for us. The next day, Richard, accompanied by Emma, arrived at Kevin's house. He parked the car in front of the modest little house and looked around. It was a simple place, but clean and well kept, which immediately caught his attention. As he entered, he was greeted by Kevin, who led him inside, where Tommy and Mrs. Martha were already waiting. Richard looked at Tommy, sitting in his wheelchair, and the expression on his face changed. He didn't say anything for a long time, just watched the boy with a thoughtful look. So, you're the Tommy your brother talks about so much. Tommy shyly nodded. Yes, sir. Richard slowly approached and crouched down to Tommy's height. Your brother is very proud of you. You know that? Tommy smiled, clearly thrilled. I'm lucky to have Kev. Richard stood up and looked at Kevin. You asked me to meet your brother, and now I understand why. He's special? Kevin just nodded, with a lump in his throat. Richard took a deep breath and, after a few seconds, spoke firmly. We'll take care of him. I'll make sure he gets the best treatment possible. Kevin felt a deep sense of relief run through his body. Richard's words were more than he had dreamed of. The hope that he had always kept burning, even in the worst of situations, seemed to have finally come true. Thank you, sir, said Kevin, with sincerity in his voice. It means a world to us. Richard smiled slightly. Maybe it's time you and your brother got what you deserve. Let's change that together. That afternoon, Richard returned to his mansion with heavy thoughts. What should have been simple retribution for saving his daughter turned out to be something much greater. Kevin's humility and determination had touched him in a way he hadn't expected. In all his years of business and accumulated wealth, he had rarely met anyone who turned down an offer of money. But Kevin didn't just refuse. He asked for something that was much more valuable, the hope of a better future for his brother. The next day, Richard decided that not only would he keep his promise, but he would do more than that. He wanted to change the lives of both brothers for good. After a series of phone calls, he arranged a consultation with one of the best doctors specializing in conditions like Tommy's. This doctor was famous for his advanced treatments. and for giving his patients a chance to improve their quality of life. Dad, I knew you'd do something great, said Emma, as they ate breakfast together. You always know what to do in the most difficult situations. Richard smiled slightly, looking at his daughter. It's not just about knowing what to do, Emma. Those boys made me realize that there's more to the world than money and power. Kevin is different. He showed me something I hadn't seen for a long time. The importance of human connections and compassion. Emma nodded, admiring the more vulnerable side of her father that she rarely saw. I'm sure it will change their lives, and maybe ours too. Over the weekend, Richard returned to Kevin's house, accompanied by Emma. This time, he brought a medical team to assess Tommy. The small house was full of nervousness and hope, and Kevin watched everything with a mixture of anxiety and gratitude. He knew that this was more than he could have imagined. The doctors carried out a series of tests on Tommy, who was visibly nervous. Kevin stayed by his side the whole time, holding his hand and offering words of encouragement. It's going to be okay, Tommy. These doctors know what they're doing, said Kevin, trying to calm him down. Tommy looked at his brother, forcing a smile. I know you always say that, Kev, but this time, I think it might be true. After the assessment, one of the doctors approached Richard and Kevin. Tommy's case is complicated, but not impossible. We can start intensive treatment which, over time, could greatly improve his mobility. He'll have a long road ahead of him, but there's hope. Kevin felt a wave of relief run through his body. Thank you, doctor. Thank you for giving my brother this chance. Richard, who was listening attentively, put a firm hand on Kevin's shoulder. We'll make sure he has everything he needs. Money won't be a problem here. Mrs. Martha, who was sitting quietly watching everything, smiled with tears in her eyes. You've brought a miracle to this house. Kevin and Tommy deserve this more than anyone. Over the next few days, the medical team began to organize Tommy's treatment. Physiotherapy sessions, medication, and careful monitoring were arranged. For the first time, Tommy began to see a future in which he could regain some of his independence. Kevin, who had always carried the weight of the world on his back, felt that he was finally beginning to see a light at the end of the tunnel. Meanwhile, Richard continued to follow the progress. He visited the house frequently, bringing not only financial resources, but also his presence and emotional support. The friendship that formed between Richard, Kevin, and Tommy was unexpected but sincere. And as the treatment progressed, Richard saw something change inside him. "Those boys have taught me as much as I've done for them," Richard confessed to Emma one day, as they walked home from another visit. "I always thought that wealth would insulate me from any kind of human suffering, but being with them, seeing how much they struggle, made me realize that there's something much bigger than the money I've accumulated." Emma, who had always admired her father, felt a deep sense of gratitude at seeing this side of him emerge. "You're becoming a better man, Dad, and they're part of it." Richard nodded, lost in thought. He wasn't just helping Kevin and Tommy. He felt he was rediscovering a part of himself that had been forgotten amid the years of business and corporate coldness. A few weeks later, Tommy had his first physiotherapy session, and the progress, although slow, was real. He was still far from being able to walk without assistance, but the doctors were optimistic. Kevin watched each session carefully, silently cheering on his brother. He knew it would be a long process, but he was determined to follow every step. "You're doing a great job, Tommy," Kevin said after one of the sessions as they walked home together. "I knew you could do it." Tommy, with a tired smile, replied, "I only make it because you never gave up on me, Kev. You're my hero." Kevin, touched by his brother's words, felt his eyes fill with tears. "I only did what any brother would do." Richard, for his part, was planning something bigger. He knew that, in addition to Tommy's treatment, Kevin also needed opportunities. During a visit, he pulled Kevin aside and said, "I want you to start studying, Kevin. You have potential, and I can make sure you go to one of the best schools in the city." Kevin looked at Richard, surprised. "Sir, I don't know what to say. That would be incredible, but what about Tommy?" Richard smiled. "We'll look after Tommy together. He'll continue with his treatment, and you'll start building his future. It's the least I can do for everything you've already done for your brother." Kevin, visibly moved, took a deep breath. "I can't thank you enough for all this. You've changed our lives." Richard shook his head, smiling. "You've changed mine too. True wealth isn't in money, Kevin. It's in the people we meet along the way. And I'm grateful to have met you and your brother." Kevin nodded, his heart full of gratitude. He knew that, despite all the challenges, his life was finally taking a different turn. A direction he would never have imagined, but one he knew was exactly what Tommy and he deserved. The days passed, and more, Kevin and Tommy got used to their new reality. Tommy's treatment was progressing well, and hope was growing with every small victory. The mere fact that Tommy was able to move his legs a little more with each physiotherapy session was cause for celebration. Kevin was always by his side, encouraging and ensuring that his brother never lost motivation. But something else was also changing. The relationship between Kevin and Richard, which was initially just one of gratitude and respect, began to evolve into something deeper. Kevin felt that Richard wasn't just helping out of obligation or because of the incident with Emma. There was something genuine in the way Richard looked at Tommy and at him. The businessman, for his part, also felt a transformation within himself. One quiet afternoon, Richard showed up at Kevin's house, as he often did, this time without the doctors or nurses. He entered the modest living room and saw Kevin and Tommy laughing together, while Mrs. Martha was knitting near the window. It was a simple scene, but rich in affection and harmony, something Richard hadn't seen for years in his own life. "Kevin, Tommy," Richard called out, approaching the small table. "Can I sit with you?" "Of course, Mr. Richard," said Kevin with a smile, pulling up a chair. "We're glad you came." Tommy, always optimistic, also greeted him. "Hi, Mr. Richard. I did very well in physiotherapy today." "Really?" asked Richard, taking a seat next to them. "That's great, Tommy. You've made great progress." As they talked, Mrs. Martha watched in silence, smiling. She, more than anyone, could see how Richard's presence had transformed the boys' lives. And not just in a financial sense. Richard brought a paternal presence that they had lost with the death of their parents. Little by little, he was becoming part of their family. After a while, Richard looked at Kevin more seriously, as if he was pondering something important. "Kevin, can I talk to you outside for a moment?" Kevin nodded, intrigued, and the two of them went out into the small garden in front of the house. The air was fresh, and the soft evening light created a peaceful atmosphere. "Kevin," Richard began, crossing his arms, "I've been thinking a lot about everything that's happened since we met, about how our lives intersected in such an unexpected way." Kevin, curious, waited in silence. He already knew that Richard was a man of few words, but when he spoke, his words always carried a weight. "I never thought that something as simple as saving my daughter could make me see life differently," Richard continued. "You and Tommy showed me something I lost a long time ago. Simplicity, the strength of family ties, unconditional love. Things that I confess I no longer understood." Kevin was surprised by Richard's frankness. "Sir, we're just trying to live as best we can." Richard smiled slightly. "And that's what impresses me. What you have is something that money can't buy. I always thought that my wealth could protect me from everything, that I didn't need anything more than it. But the truth is that I isolated myself. I was living in a bubble." Kevin nodded, understanding a little more about the man in front of him. Richard, for all his wealth, seemed to have lived a lonely life. Perhaps fortune had taken him away from the things that really mattered. "I feel grateful," said Richard, his voice softer now. "Grateful to have found you. And I'm not just talking about saving Emma. I'm talking about how you helped me rediscover something I'd lost. True wealth lies in the connections we build." Kevin was silent for a moment, absorbing those words. He had never imagined that someone like Richard could miss something as simple as human connection. For Kevin, who had always lived without much money, love and family had always been what he valued most. "I don't know what to say, sir," Kevin finally replied. "I think life puts us in people's paths for a reason. Maybe we were meant to meet." Richard nodded. "Maybe. And that's why from now on, I want you to know that I'm not just here as someone who's going to help out financially. I'm here as a friend, and if you allow, as part of the family." Kevin moved, looked at the man in front of him, and saw in him something he rarely found in others: sincerity. He knew that for Richard, that gesture meant much more than the words spoken. "You're already part of the family, sir," said Kevin with a shy smile. "Tommy always talks about you as if you were a second father." Richard, visibly moved, smiled back. "This means a lot to me, Kevin. Much more than any success I've ever had in business." The two sat in silence for a moment, watching the sky begin to tint with orange hues as the sun set over the horizon. It was a peaceful scene, full of meaning. "Well," said Richard at last, "I think it's time for me to go. But I'll see you soon." Kevin nodded, shaking Richard's hand firmly. "Thank you for everything, sir." "Everything, really?" Richard smiled and before leaving said, "You're welcome, Kevin. But remember, this friendship is a two-way street. I'm learning from you too." Kevin watched Richard walk away, feeling a warmth in his chest. He knew that this relationship was much more than simple gratitude for a heroic act. It was the start of something bigger, something that wasn't based on wealth or favors, but on mutual respect and genuine love. When he went back into the house, he was greeted by Tommy's smile. "What did he want, Kev?" Kevin sat down next to his brother, still processing everything. "He just wanted to say that we're more than friends now. I think he wants to be part of our family." Tommy smiled broadly. "I already knew that." Kevin laughed, putting his hand on Tommy's shoulder. "You always knew things before I did. And so, in that small home, something more valuable than any fortune began to grow. A true friendship based on love, connection, and the power to see beyond money and circumstances." The days became lighter for Kevin, Tommy, and Mrs. Martha. Tommy's treatment was progressing well, and the friendship between the two families continued to grow. Richard made a point of visiting the boys often, bringing with him not only financial help, but a warm companionship that had become fundamental for all of them. On one of these visits, Richard sat down next to Tommy in the small living room. The boy was more cheerful than ever, his progress in physiotherapy filling him with hope. He could move his legs more easily and, with the help of a walker, could now take a few short steps. Richard watched Tommy's every achievement with a mixture of pride and admiration. "You're doing great, Tommy," said Richard, smiling. "Soon you'll be running around." Tommy laughed, still panting from the last exercise session. "I can't wait to play soccer with Kevin." "Do you think I can?" Richard nodded. "With your determination, I have no doubt that you will." Mrs. Martha, sitting by the window with her knitting, watched the scene with tender eyes. For her, seeing how much Richard cared for the boys was something that brought her inner peace. She knew that, with him by their side, Kevin and Tommy would have a much brighter future than she could ever have imagined. Kevin, on the other hand, remained attentive to Richard's every visit, feeling a mixture of gratitude and something deeper. He knew that, in addition to everything Richard was doing for Tommy, there was a transformation taking place within the businessman. Richard was no longer the distant man Kevin had known at first. He was now part of the small but loving family that Kevin and Tommy had formed. One afternoon, Richard arrived at the house with a more serious expression than usual. Kevin, noticing this, asked, "Is everything all right, Mr. Richard?" Richard hesitated for a moment, seeming to ponder his words. "Yes, Kevin, everything is fine, but I need to share something with you. Something I've been thinking about for a while." Kevin, curious, nodded. "Sure, go ahead." Richard took a deep breath before beginning. "I grew up in a very wealthy family. I always had everything I wanted, but at the same time, I always felt that something was missing. My parents were distant, too busy with business to care about things like family ties. And I followed the same path for a long time." He paused, looking out of the window as if searching for the right words. "When I met you, something changed. I began to realize what really matters. I saw the way you take care of Tommy, how Mrs. Martha sacrifices so much for you, and I realized that true wealth isn't in the material things we own, but in the people we share our lives with." Kevin remained silent, absorbing Richard's words. He knew that the businessman had changed, but hearing it out loud made it all seem even more real. "You've always had this wealth," Richard continued, with a slight smile. "Even without the money, without the luxuries that I had, you and Tommy have something that I've spent my whole life looking for. And it was with you that I rediscovered the value of what it means to really care about someone." Kevin, touched by this revelation, replied sincerely, "Mr. Richard, we only did what we always believed was right. Love and family are the most important things to us. And with your help, we finally have a chance to live a better life." Richard nodded, still looking away, but then turned his attention to Kevin. "I want you to know that, for me, you're not just a responsibility. You're an important part of my life now." Kevin smiled, feeling a warmth in his chest. "We consider you part of our family too, sir. Tommy talks about you a lot, and I think he already sees you as a father." Richard, visibly moved, discreetly wiped his eyes. "It means a lot to me, Kevin, much more than I could ever express." A few days later, Richard decided to take Kevin and Tommy to visit his mansion. He wanted them to see the place where he had lived for so many years, in the hope that they would better understand who he was and where he came from. When they arrived, Tommy was amazed by the size of the house. "Wow, Kev, this house is bigger than anything I've ever seen." Kevin was also impressed, but tried to cover it up. "Pretty big, yeah," he replied as they walked across the vast lawn that surrounded the property. Richard guided them inside the mansion, showing them the different rooms, each decorated with luxurious furniture and expensive works of art. But despite the grandeur, Kevin sensed a certain coldness in the atmosphere. The house, as impressive as it was, seemed empty. Something was missing. "This house is beautiful, but I've never really felt at home here," Richard confessed as they walked through the corridors. "It's always been more of a representation of my financial success than a real home." Tommy, always direct, asked, "What now? Do you still think you need all this?" Richard paused for a moment, thinking about the question. "No, Tommy. I've realized that it's all just superficial. What I really need are people with whom I can share my life. And now I feel I have that with you." Kevin looked at Richard, sensing the honesty in his words. It was clear that for Richard, this new phase of his life was not just about helping the boys financially, but about finding a new reason to live. At the end of the visit, as they were leaving the mansion, Richard looked at the two of them and said, "You've taught me something I've never learned in all these years of business. True wealth lies not in what we own, but in the relationships we cultivate." Kevin nodded with a sincere smile. "We've always thought so, Mr. Richard, and we're glad you're part of our lives now." Tommy added excitedly, "You're part of our family now. That's what matters." Richard smiled, feeling an inner peace he hadn't experienced for years. He finally understood that, despite all the success he had achieved in the business world, what mattered most was what he had built with Kevin, Tommy, and Mrs. Martha. A family, a true connection. And that was something no amount of money in the world could buy. Richard returned to Kevin and Tommy's house on a regular basis. It was a routine he had never imagined he would have, but curiously, it filled him in a way that his mansion or his business never could. He had become part of something bigger, something that made him feel connected and alive. On one of these visits, sitting at the small kitchen table, Richard, Kevin, and Mrs. Martha chatted while Tommy finished one of his physiotherapy sessions. The air was light, the smell of fresh coffee filled the room, and the feeling of familiarity was undeniable. "You've really changed our lives, Mr. Richard," said Kevin, breaking the silence that hung over them. "I'll never be able to thank you enough for what you've done for Tommy. He's getting better every day." Richard, who was taking a sip of coffee, placed his cup on the table and looked at Kevin seriously. "Kevin, you need to understand that what I've done for Tommy is nothing compared to what you've done for me." Kevin frowned, confused. "But I didn't do anything, sir." "You've done more than you know," Richard replied in a calm but firm voice. "When I met you, I was a man surrounded by wealth, but isolated. I thought money would solve all my problems, but I felt empty. You and Tommy showed me what really matters, what it means to be there for those you love. I had lost that." Kevin remained silent, feeling the weight of Richard's words. He had never thought that he could impact the life of someone so powerful. For him, his life was simple: work hard, look after Tommy, and make sure the two of them stayed together. But for Richard, it represented something much bigger. "You're a good man, Kevin," Richard continued. "You sacrificed so much for your brother, and yet you never complained. You never asked for anything for yourself. That's rare. I've seen people much richer than you, and none of them had your strength." Kevin looked at the floor, not knowing what to say. He had always done what he believed was right, without expecting recognition. For him, looking after Tommy was his obligation, his duty as an older brother. But hearing Richard's words made him realize that perhaps his efforts had a greater meaning than he had imagined. Before he could reply, Tommy entered the room, still panting from the physiotherapy, but with a smile on his face. "Hi guys, I'm done for the day. I think I'm getting stronger." Richard stood up and ruffled Tommy's hair affectionately. "You really are, kid. You're doing great." Tommy looked at Kevin and Richard, realizing that the conversation had been serious before he arrived. "Did I miss something?" Kevin smiled and shook his head. "Nothing important, Tommy. We were just talking about how strong you are." Mrs. Martha, who had been watching everything with her gentle smile, finally spoke. "You're all stronger than you realize. Every single one of you. I've seen how much you've grown since Mr. Richard came into our lives." Richard looked at Mrs. Martha with gratitude. "You've been a great strength to them too, Martha. I admire what you've done for these boys." She nodded, her eyes shining with emotion. "I just kept the promise I made to their mother. And now I see that that promise was about more than keeping the boys together. It was also about giving them the chance to be happy." A few days later, Richard decided to take Kevin and Tommy somewhere special. He invited them to spend a day at a cabin he owned in the mountains, away from the city and the frenetic pace of everyday life. It was a place he rarely went, but now it seemed the perfect refuge for them to reflect on everything that had happened. The journey was peaceful. The cool mountain wind welcomed them as they drove up the winding road, and the sound of nature seemed to calm their thoughts. When they arrived at the cabin, Tommy was visibly excited. "Wow, this place is amazing. It's one of my favorite places," said Richard as he opened the cabin door. "Here, I always feel at peace, and I think it's the right place for us to do something important." Kevin looked at Richard, puzzled. "Something important?" Richard nodded. "I want you to have this place, the cabin. I've decided that I'm going to give it to you." Kevin was paralyzed for a moment, surprise evident on his face. "Mr. Richard, we can't accept that. This place must be very valuable." Richard smiled, placing a hand on Kevin's shoulder. "Kevin, the value of this place is not in what it's worth in money, but in what it means. I want you and Tommy to have a place where you can come whenever you need peace, time for yourselves. A place that belongs to you." Tommy, who was listening carefully, was elated. "Really, Mr. Richard? The cabin is going to be ours?" "Yes, Tommy," said Richard, laughing at the boy's excitement. "It's going to be yours." Kevin, still processing Richard's generosity, finally gave in. "I can't thank you enough, sir. This is more than we could have imagined." Richard shook his head. "You've already given me everything I need. This is just a gift, and I know you'll enjoy it much more than I ever did." That night in the cabin was unlike anything Kevin and Tommy had ever experienced. Together, they spent hours talking, laughing, and telling stories. Richard seemed more relaxed and open than ever, as if the emotional journey he had been on with them was finally complete. As the fire crackled in the fireplace and the stars twinkled in the clear mountain sky, Richard made one last confession. "I was lost before I met you," he admitted, his voice soft in the darkness. "But you found me, and now I know what really matters." Kevin, sitting next to Tommy, looked at the man who months ago was just a distant businessman and now was a friend, a vital part of his life. "You found us too, sir, and you changed our lives in a way we'll never forget." Tommy, with a smile on his face, concluded, "We're a family now." And at that moment, in the peaceful silence of the mountains, with the warmth of the fireplace and the presence of the people he had learned to love, Richard finally understood the true meaning of wealth. It wasn't property, money, or business that mattered. It was the family, the connections, the love, and that, he knew, was something he would never let go of again. As Tommy's treatment progressed and the brothers' lives finally stabilized, Kevin began to notice something new in Richard. It wasn't just gratitude or the satisfaction of helping. Richard was changed in a way that was hard to describe. He seemed more present, more human, as if he had found something he had lost for a long time. One quiet afternoon, Richard arrived at Kevin and Tommy's house with an unexpected proposal. After talking about Tommy's progress and sharing some stories, he turned to Kevin with a serious look on his face. "Kevin, I've been thinking a lot about everything we've experienced over the last few months," he began, his voice soft but firm. "I've already helped you in many ways, but I feel there's more I can do." Kevin frowned, curious. "Mr. Richard, you've already done more for us than we could ask for. You don't need to worry about anything else." Richard shook his head, smiling slightly. "I don't see it as a concern. I see it as an opportunity. You have a lot of potential, Kevin, and I don't want all that talent to go to waste." Kevin blinked, confused. "Talent? I'm just a shoeshine boy who looks after his brother. I don't know what you're talking about." Richard leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees, his eyes fixed on Kevin. "You have more than you realize, Kevin. Your determination, your sense of responsibility, your ability to lead. These are all qualities that few people possess, and I think it's time you use them to build a future for yourself." Kevin was silent, absorbing the words. He had never thought of himself as someone with the potential for something great. He had always seen himself as the older brother who did what needed to be done. But Richard's words echoed in his mind in a way he couldn't ignore. "And what do you have in mind?" asked Kevin, cautious but interested. Richard smiled, as if he had been expecting this question. "I want you to study. I want to give you the chance to get into one of the best schools in the city. With your dedication and intelligence, I'm sure you'll excel. And eventually, that could open doors that you can't even imagine." Kevin was silent for a few moments, thinking about the proposal. He knew it would be a great opportunity, but his first concern had always been Tommy. "What about Tommy?" Kevin finally asked, the concern evident in his voice. "I can't leave my brother behind." Richard nodded, already anticipating this reaction. "Tommy will continue with his treatment, and I won't let him lack anything. We'll make sure he has everything he needs while you study. You won't be separated." Kevin looked at Richard, his thoughts racing. It was an opportunity he'd never imagined he'd have. But at the same time, the idea of focusing on himself, after so many years dedicated exclusively to Tommy's well-being, seemed far away. "I don't know, sir," said Kevin hesitantly. "School's been so long since I stopped studying. Can I make it?" Richard put a firm hand on Kevin's shoulder, looking directly into his eyes. "You could do it, Kevin. If there's one thing I've learned about you in these months, it's that you never give up. That's all you need." Kevin took a deep breath, feeling the seriousness of the moment. It was a life-changing decision, but in a way, he knew it was the natural next step. He had spent so much time looking after Tommy, sacrificing his own dreams, that perhaps now was the time to think about the future. "I'll try," Kevin said at last, his voice determined. "If you think I can do it, I'll try." Richard smiled, satisfied. "I know you'll do more than try, Kevin. You'll succeed." Over the next few days, Richard arranged for Kevin to be enrolled in one of the best schools in the city. Things happened quickly. Within a few days, Kevin had his school materials in hand, ready to start a new stage in his life. The first morning at school was a nervous one for Kevin. He was used to the streets, to hard work as a shoeshine boy, and now he was about to enter a completely new environment. But as he walked to school, he thought of Tommy, Richard, and everything they had been through. It gave him strength. When he arrived at the school, Kevin was met by a guidance counselor who showed him to his classroom. He felt out of place at first. The other students were younger, came from wealthy families, and talked about things he couldn't relate to. But despite this, Kevin held his head high. He knew he was there for a bigger reason. During the first few weeks, Kevin dedicated himself to his studies with the same determination he always had for his work and caring for Tommy. And little by little, he realized that his efforts were paying off. He began to excel in class. The teachers noticed his intelligence and dedication, and even the other students began to respect him. At home, Tommy followed Kevin's progress with enthusiasm. "Kev, you're amazing," said Tommy whenever Kevin told him about his achievements. "I knew you'd do well." Kevin smiled, proud but always modest. "I'm just doing what I can, Tommy, and it's all for us." Richard was also proud of Kevin, visiting the house often to check on his progress. On one such visit, he told Kevin, "I knew you had potential. You're just starting out, but I'm sure you'll go far." Kevin nodded, feeling for the first time that his future could be much more than he had imagined. Over time, Kevin excelled even more at school, becoming one of the best students in his class. He knew it was only the beginning, but for the first time in years, he felt he was in control of his own life. He was building something new, something that wasn't just for Tommy, but for him too. And although the journey was just beginning, Kevin knew that, with the support of Richard, Tommy, and Ms. Martha, he could achieve anything. Now, he was no longer just surviving. He was living. Kevin's days at school soon turned into a routine. He would wake up early, make coffee for himself and Tommy, and then head out to face another day at school. Over time, the initial anxiety was replaced by a growing confidence. He no longer felt out of place among the other students, and his determination began to stand out, gaining the attention of teachers and classmates. One such morning, as he was leaving the house, Tommy called out to him before he got through the door. "Kev, wait." Kevin stopped and turned around, seeing his brother approaching with a smile on his face. "What is it, Tommy?" Tommy stared at him, full of pride. "I just wanted to say how proud I am of you. I knew you'd do well at school, but you seem to be excelling." Kevin gave a shy smile. "I'm doing my best, Tommy, and everything I do is for both of us. You know that." Tommy shook his head, determined. "I know, Kev, but now it's your turn. You've always done everything for me. It's time you did something for yourself too." These words echoed in Kevin's mind as he walked to school. It was true. For so many years, he had put Tommy as his absolute priority. And although that was never going to change, he was now beginning to understand that he also deserved to have his own achievements. At school, Kevin stood out more and more. He dedicated himself to his studies with the same intensity that he had worked on the streets to support his family. It wasn't long before he became one of the best students, and the teachers noticed his dedication. One day, after a particularly challenging lesson, the history teacher, Mr. Mitchell, asked to speak to Kevin after class. Kevin was a little apprehensive, but approached the teacher's desk at the end of the lesson. "Kevin, I wanted to tell you that I'm impressed with your progress," said the teacher with an approving smile. "You have a natural talent for learning, and your dedication is something rare to see." Kevin smiled gratefully. "Thank you, sir. I'm just trying to make the most of this opportunity." Mr. Mitchell nodded. "And you're doing a great job. You have a future, Kevin. If you keep this up, you can achieve great things. Have you thought about going to college?" The question took Kevin by surprise. College? He had never given it any serious thought. His whole life had been focused on making sure Tommy had what he needed, and he could hardly imagine going to college with all the responsibilities that would bring. I don't know, sir," Kevin replied honestly. "I've never given it much thought. I've always had to look after my brother." Mr. Mitchell looked at him with understanding. "I understand that you have responsibilities, but don't dismiss the idea. College can open many doors, and from what I see in you, I believe you have the potential to go very far." Kevin thanked her for her words, but thought about it for the rest of the day. Could he really follow this path? The idea of going to college seemed far away, but at the same time, it began to feel more possible with each passing day. At home, Kevin shared this conversation with Richard on one of his regular visits. The two of them were sitting at the kitchen table, while Tommy was playing with something in his room. "College, huh?" said Richard, with a satisfied smile on his face. "That's amazing, Kevin. Have you thought about what you'd like to study?" Kevin shrugged, still a little unsure. "I never thought about it, Mr. Richard. I always thought that college wasn't an option for me. But now maybe." Richard shook his head, as if to remove any doubt. "Of course it's an option for you, Kevin. If that's what you want, I'll make sure you have all the resources to follow that path. You deserve this opportunity as much as anyone." Kevin was silent for a moment, absorbing what Richard had said. Knowing that he had the support made all the difference. "I'm still trying to figure out what I want to do. I don't think I've ever had time to think about myself." Richard smiled, understanding. "That's normal. You've spent so much time looking after others that you've forgotten to look after yourself. But now it's your turn, Kevin, and whatever you choose, I'll be here to support you." Kevin nodded, feeling a weight lifted from his shoulders. Knowing that he had Richard's support and that Tommy was well looked after gave him the confidence to start imagining a different future. A few months later, Kevin's progress at school continued to impress. He had become a role model for the other students, and his determination was a source of admiration among teachers and classmates. And over time, he began to seriously consider the possibility of going to college. One day, over dinner, Tommy looked at Kevin curiously. "Kev, have you decided what you want to do after school?" Kevin put his fork down and looked at his brother. "I'm still thinking, Tommy, but I think I want to study business. Maybe that will help me do something big in the future." Tommy smiled broadly. "I think you'll be the best at it. And you know what? One day you'll have your own company." Kevin laughed, surprised by his brother's optimism. "My own company? I don't know if I'm that ambitious." But even as he laughed, the idea began to germinate in his mind. Perhaps in time he could really build something for himself and Tommy, something that went beyond survival, something that would give them stability and pride. And with Richard's support and Tommy's encouragement, Kevin began to allow himself to dream of a future he had never imagined for himself. College, a career, maybe even his own company. The possibilities that had seemed so distant before were now beginning to materialize before his eyes. What had once been just a life of constant struggle now seemed to be turning into something more. Kevin knew he still had a long way to go, but for the first time, he could clearly see the opportunities ahead of him. And with Tommy by his side and Richard as a guide and friend, he was ready to face any challenge that came his way. Kevin wasn't just surviving anymore. He was building a future that would be theirs, and that he could finally call his own. The following months brought even more significant changes for Kevin. He was excelling at school, but now, with the idea of going to college becoming more and more concrete, a new feeling began to grow. The possibility of dreaming of a truly promising future. And with that came an unexpected challenge, balancing caring for Tommy, his studies, and the dreams he was beginning to cultivate. One afternoon, after another long day at school, Kevin returned home to find Tommy sitting at the kitchen table with Mrs. Martha, who was preparing a simple soup. The atmosphere in the house was always welcoming, and Kevin was grateful for that. But there was something in Tommy's eyes that afternoon that indicated something was bothering his brother. "Hey Tommy, how was physical therapy today?" asked Kevin as he hung up his backpack. Tommy shrugged, looking down at the floor. "It was good, but I've been thinking. Kevin moved closer, sensing the worry in the air. Thinking about what? Tommy finally looked up, his eyes full of doubt. Kev, what if you go to college? What will happen to me? Kevin felt a squeeze in his heart. He knew this moment would come, but he hadn't expected it to be so soon. All along, he had focused on taking care of Tommy and making sure he got the treatment he needed. But now, with the possibility of following his own dreams, Kevin was faced with the difficult question of how to balance everything. He sat down next to his brother, putting a hand on Tommy's shoulder. Tommy, nothing will ever change. I'll always be here for you. College will be important, but you're my priority. Tommy bit his lip, trying to hold back his emotion. I know, Kev, but what if I'm a burden to you? What if you miss out on opportunities because you have to look after me? Kevin shook his head firmly. You've never been a burden, Tommy. Never. I do what I do because I love you, and that will never change. Mrs. Martha, who until then had been quiet, interrupted gently with her ever-present wisdom. Kevin, your brother knows how much you care about him, but he's also worried about you. Maybe now is the time for all of us to support each other in different ways. Kevin looked at Mrs. Martha, absorbing her words. He knew she was right. The situation called for a new approach, a way to ensure that he could follow his dreams without leaving Tommy behind. I have an idea, said Kevin, looking at Tommy and Mrs. Martha. Mr. Richard has already done so much for us, and I know he cares about our family. Maybe we can find a way to make sure that you, Tommy, have all the help you need while I study. Tommy frowned. You mean, ask Mr. Richard for more help? Kevin nodded. Not only that, I think he can help us come up with a plan, something that works for everyone. I'll still be here for you, Tommy, but maybe we can divide up the responsibilities in a way that allows me to pursue my studies. Mrs. Martha smiled, pleased with Kevin's maturity. That sounds like a good idea. Sometimes accepting help is the hardest part, but it's also the most important. That evening, Kevin called Richard and explained the situation. As always, Richard was ready to listen and help. He understood Kevin's delicate position, balancing the dreams that were finally starting to come true with the responsibility of looking after Tommy. Kevin, said Richard, his voice firm on the other end of the line. You know I'm here for whatever you need. I want you to go to college, but I also know that Tommy is your priority. Let's do this together. We can find specialized caregivers to help, to make sure Tommy gets everything he needs. Kevin sighed, relieved to hear those words. Thank you, Mr. Richard. I don't want to leave Tommy behind, but I don't want to miss this chance either. You won't miss it, Richard assured him. This is a new phase for both of you, and I'll make sure you both have the support you need. Don't worry. Over the next few days, Richard kept his promise. He helped Kevin organize a scheme whereby specialist carers would visit Tommy regularly, helping with his physiotherapy sessions and ensuring that he had all the assistance he needed. Mrs. Martha also offered to continue helping as she always had, but now with the peace of mind of knowing that Tommy would have the professional support he needed. With this support network in place, Kevin was finally able to focus more on his studies in college. He knew that Tommy was in good hands, and that gave him the confidence he needed to move forward. One day, on his way home from school, Kevin went to the library to do some research on business courses. He had decided that with a good education, he could one day build something that would not only help him and Tommy, but could also repay the generosity that Richard and so many other people had shown. When he got home, he found Tommy in the living room, smiling when he saw him come in. So, how was your day, Mr. Future Businessman? Kevin laughed and sat down next to his brother. It was good, Tommy. I'm getting ready for college. Which reminds me, how are you? Tommy gave a reassuring smile. I'm fine, Kev. The caregivers are nice, and Ms. Martha still fills me with stories while the physical therapy is going on. Everything's going well. Kevin sighed, feeling the relief of knowing that everything was working according to plan. That's good, Tommy. I know it's not going to be easy, but we're managing. Tommy nodded, looking at his brother with admiration. You're doing it, Kev, and I'm here to support you, like you've always done for me. Kevin smiled, touched by his brother's words. We've always been in this together, Tommy, and we're going to stay that way, no matter what. And so Kevin realized that, even with all the responsibilities and challenges, he was starting to build something bigger than he had ever imagined. He wasn't just creating a future for himself. He was ensuring that he and Tommy had the life they deserved, surrounded by love, support, and, above all, hope. The weeks passed, and Kevin dedicated himself intensely to his studies, but without ever losing sight of his commitment to Tommy. The support network that Richard had helped organize was working perfectly, and this allowed Kevin to focus more on his future. However, something unexpected began to form: a friendship between Kevin and Emma, Richard's daughter. Emma had been visiting Kevin and Tommy's house regularly since the incident in which Kevin had saved her. But as time went by, her visits became more frequent and involved more than just casual conversations. She began to help Kevin with his studies, bringing books and materials that she thought would be useful for his development. One afternoon, after a study session, Kevin and Emma were sitting in the small garden at the front of the house, watching the sun go down. The mood between them was light, but there was a different energy in the air, something they both seemed to feel, but didn't know exactly how to express. "You've helped me a lot, Emma," said Kevin, breaking the silence. "I can't thank you enough." Emma laughed softly. "You've already saved me once, Kevin. I guess the least I can do is help you get ready for college." Kevin smiled, but there was something else he wanted to say. He felt that their relationship was growing, but he didn't know how to put it into words. Emma seemed to read his thoughts because after a few seconds of silence, she spoke. "You know," Emma began, looking at the horizon, "since that day you saved me, a lot has changed. Not just for you and Tommy, but for me too." Kevin frowned, curious. "What do you mean?" She sighed, choosing her words carefully. "I've always been surrounded by luxury and comfort, but as I spent more time with you and your family, I began to realize that true wealth lies in how we treat each other. Seeing the love you have for Tommy, your determination to look after him, it made me rethink a lot of things." Kevin remained silent, listening intently. He had never thought that his life could have such an impact on someone like Emma, who came from a world so different from his own. "And what have you rethought?" he asked, intrigued. Emma looked at him directly, her eyes reflecting something deeper. "I realized that I had always lived in a bubble. Everything was given to me without effort, and I never really valued what I had. But you fight every day for something greater. You've made me see that there's more to life than what money can buy." Kevin shifted uncomfortably, not used to this kind of attention. "I just do what I think is right, Emma. I never thought it would inspire anyone." Emma gave a small smile. "But you have, and not just me. My father too. He's always been focused on work and success, but now he's different. And it's because of you." Kevin looked at the floor, absorbing what Emma was saying. He knew that Richard had changed, but he didn't see himself as the cause of it. For him, everything he did was for Tommy, and the rest seemed to happen around him. "I don't know if I'm responsible for this," he said at last, still at a loss for words, "but I'm glad things are changing." Emma leaned a little closer. "Yes, you are responsible, Kevin. And I'm glad I met you." Kevin felt his heart beat faster at Emma's closeness. He had never thought anything like this could happen, such a strong connection with someone from a world so different from his own. But there they were, in the small garden, sharing something that went beyond friendship. Before he could answer, Tommy appeared in the doorway, interrupting the moment. "Hey Kev, Mrs. Martha's calling you for dinner." Kevin and Emma moved away quickly, laughing at the situation. "We're coming, Tommy," replied Kevin, still feeling the warmth of the previous moment. As they stood up to go inside, Emma looked at Kevin one last time with an enigmatic smile. "I think we still have a lot to talk about, Kevin." Kevin nodded, not knowing exactly what the future held for them, but sensing that something important was brewing. As the days went by, Kevin and Emma's relationship continued to strengthen. They spent more time together studying and talking about life. Emma always brought a new perspective, and Kevin felt more and more at ease with her. At the same time, Richard noticed the closeness between the two, but didn't say anything, respecting the space they were creating. One day, Richard pulled Kevin aside while they were on one of their usual visits to the house. "Kevin, you and Emma seem to be getting closer." Kevin, taken aback by the remark, tried to hide his discomfort. "Yes, Mr. Richard. She's been helping me a lot with my studies." Richard smiled understandingly. "Emma has always been very devoted to the people she cares about. I can see it in the way she talks about you." Kevin remained silent, trying to understand what Richard was getting at. There's no need to worry, Kevin, Richard continued, noticing the boy's hesitation. I trust you, and I trust Emma. If something else is going on between you, I just want you to know that you have my support. Kevin felt a sense of relief wash over him. He had never imagined that he would have this conversation with Richard, and the last thing he wanted was to cause any discomfort in the family that had helped him so much. Thank you, Mr. Richard. I don't really know what's going on, but I appreciate your support. Richard nodded, pleased with Kevin's sincerity. Whatever happens, Kevin, just know that you're part of our family now. And Emma, well, she's special, just like you. As the days continued to pass, Kevin found himself more confident not only in his studies, but also in his personal life. His friendship with Emma was gradually turning into something deeper, and Richard and Tommy's support was strengthening him with every step he took. Kevin was building a new life and, along with it, new relationships that he had never imagined possible. The struggles he had faced so far had made him strong, and now he was beginning to reap the rewards of his perseverance. The future, which had once seemed uncertain, was now shaping up in brighter colors and with possibilities he could hardly believe. And deep down, he knew that, whatever happened, he would no longer be alone on this journey. He had his family and perhaps a new love. The months passed, and the friendship between Kevin and Emma blossomed into something even stronger. What began as a simple gesture of gratitude for Kevin's saving Emma was now turning into a deep connection, full of mutual admiration and affection. Richard, watching this relationship grow, just smiled in silence, proud of them both. One afternoon, after another visit by Emma to Kevin's house, the two decided to take a walk through the city streets. The sun was setting, tinging the sky with shades of orange and gold, while a light breeze made the weather pleasant. I like these moments, said Emma, breaking the silence as they walked side by side. It's nice to be out of the routine, just enjoying it. Kevin agreed, smiling at her. I like it too. It's been a while since my life has been all hustle and bustle. Here, it's a bit of peace. She looked at him with a fond look. You deserve more of that, Kevin. Much more than just peace for a few moments. After everything you've been through, it's time to think about you. Kevin shrugged, still fighting the habit of putting other people's needs before his own. I just do what I think is right. Looking after Tommy has always been my priority. I don't know if I can change that now. Emma stopped and faced him, placing a gentle hand on his arm. I understand, but you need to allow yourself to have more. You have dreams, Kevin. Don't put them aside. It's not selfish to want to be happy. Kevin was silent for a few seconds, absorbing what she had said. He knew Emma was right, but it was hard to change years of total dedication to his brother. Tommy had always been the center of his life, and now, with all these new opportunities coming up, Kevin found himself in a dilemma. Follow his own dreams or continue to devote himself completely to taking care of his brother. I just don't want Tommy to feel like I'm leaving him behind, Kevin finally said. Emma shook her head with a soft smile. Tommy knows how much you care about him, and I'm sure he'd be happy to see you fulfilling your own dreams. Kevin sighed. Maybe you're right. I'm not used to thinking like that. She gently pulled him to continue walking. I know, but I'm here to remind you that you deserve it. And besides, you're not alone. Whatever you decide to do, we'll support you. Kevin looked at her, grateful for her words. He had never imagined that he would have someone like Emma by his side, someone who understood him so deeply and who encouraged him to be more than he himself believed he could be. The next day, Richard paid an unexpected visit to Kevin's house. He looked more serious than usual, and Kevin noticed this as soon as he entered. Mr. Richard, is everything all right? Kevin asked, offering him a chair. Richard sighed and sat down. Yes, Kevin, everything's fine, but I want to talk to you about something important. Kevin sat down opposite him, worried. Of course. What is it? Richard stared at him for a moment, as if assessing the best way to broach the subject. Kevin, you've already done a lot for Tommy. You're an example of dedication and sacrifice, and I admire that deeply. But now I want to talk about you. Kevin frowned. About me? Richard nodded. Yes, you've done a great job at school. You've dedicated yourself like nobody's business. But I realize that you still have trouble accepting the idea that you deserve to have your own dreams. Kevin looked at the floor, uncomfortable. It's difficult, sir. I never saw myself as someone who could do great things." Richard leaned forward, his voice firm but full of affection. "But you can, and you must. I know Tommy is your priority and always will be, but now it's time for you to think about your future too. I want to help you take that next step." Kevin looked at Richard, not sure what to say. "I just don't know if I'm ready." Richard smiled. "I know you are, and you don't have to do it alone. I've been thinking, I want to offer you an internship at my company. I think it's the next logical step for you to start building something of your own, while still looking after Tommy." Kevin was stunned by the offer. He had never imagined that Richard, such a successful man, would consider offering him an internship. "An internship? At your company?" Richard nodded, smiling. "Yes, you have potential, Kevin, and I want to help you develop it. I'm not just offering this out of gratitude for what you've done for my daughter. I'm offering because I believe in you." Kevin felt a wave of emotions wash over him. The opportunity Richard was offering was something he would never have dreamed of. He thought of Tommy, he thought of Emma, and he thought of the future that was slowly beginning to take shape in front of him. "I don't know what to say, Mr. Richard," Kevin said sincerely. "This is more than I could have imagined." Richard patted Kevin on the shoulder, smiling. "Tell him you accept. I know it may sound scary, but trust me, you're ready for it." Kevin took a deep breath and, after a long moment of thought, nodded. "I accept, sir. I'll do my best." Richard smiled broadly. "I know you will, and I'm sure you'll do very well." Over the next few days, Kevin began preparing for his internship at Richard's company. It was a new chapter in his life, full of expectations and challenges. He knew it would be difficult to balance his studies, the internship, and looking after Tommy, but he also knew he wasn't alone. With Emma by his side, Tommy's unconditional support, and Richard's guidance, Kevin felt more confident than ever. That evening, after a quiet family dinner, Tommy looked at Kevin with a mischievous smile. "Hey Kev, now that you're going to be working with Mr. Richard, can you give me a job there too?" Kevin laughed, shaking his head. "Let's take it easy, Tommy. Let me adjust first, then we'll see." But as they laughed together, Kevin felt, deep down in his heart, that he was on the right track. Life was finally giving him the chance to be more than he ever imagined he could be. And with his family by his side, he knew that whatever challenges came his way, he was prepared to face them. The future, once uncertain, now looked promising. Kevin was ready to embrace every opportunity that came his way, and he knew he would never be alone on this journey. Kevin's internship at Richard's company began smoothly, but full of expectations. He was anxious, but also determined to prove himself. When he arrived at the office for the first time, wearing clothes that Emma had helped him choose, he felt that this was a defining moment in his life. The large building, with its glass walls and constant movement, was a completely different world from the streets where he had spent years shining shoes. On his first day, Richard introduced him to the other employees and made a point of highlighting Kevin's potential. "This is Kevin, and he's going to be with us for a while. He's dedicated and hardworking, and I'm sure you'll all enjoy having him here." The staff greeted him politely, and Kevin tried hard to hide his nervousness. It was all so new and intimidating, but he knew that with effort and focus, he could adapt. Richard put him under the supervision of one of his trusted managers, Mr. Collins, an experienced and attentive man. "Kevin, let's start slowly," said Mr. Collins as he showed him around the office. "I want you to learn as much as possible, but take your time. I'm here to help you." Kevin was grateful for the patience and understanding. He knew he was entering uncharted territory, but he had a fierce desire to learn and excel. He spent the first few weeks familiarizing himself with the company's processes, absorbing all the information he could, while working hard to impress both Richard and Mr. Collins. At the end of each day, Kevin returned home exhausted but satisfied. He shared every detail with Tommy and Mrs. Martha, who listened enthusiastically. Tommy, always curious, asked questions about the offices, the meetings, and the people he met. "So, Kev," asked Tommy one evening while they were having dinner, "are you already bossing everyone around?" Kevin laughed, shaking his head. "Not yet, Tommy, but I'm learning a lot. Who knows one day?" Mrs. Martha, with her warm smile, added, "You're walking a beautiful path, Kevin. I'm very proud of you. Never doubt that you are exactly where you should be." These words filled Kevin's heart with gratitude and motivation. He knew the journey wouldn't be easy, but he was determined to keep going. A few weeks later, Richard asked Kevin to attend an important meeting. "I want you to see how decisions are made in a big company," he said. "This will be a good opportunity to learn something that books don't teach you." Kevin was nervous, but also excited. He knew this was a golden chance to better understand the business world and learn from experienced people. As he entered the meeting room, he was faced with impeccably dressed businessmen discussing numbers and strategies. Kevin, sitting next to Richard, listened attentively to every word. At the end of the meeting, Richard looked at Kevin. "So, what did you think?" Kevin hesitated for a moment, but then answered truthfully. "It was impressive, but to be honest, I'm still trying to make sense of it all." Richard laughed softly. "And that's exactly how it should be in the beginning. You're learning, Kevin. Don't expect to understand everything at once. The important thing is to keep absorbing as much as you can." Kevin smiled, relieved. "I'll make an effort." "I know you will," said Richard, patting him on the shoulder. "You're on the right track." As the internship progressed, Kevin began to feel more confident. He started taking on small responsibilities and attending meetings more often. Every challenge he faced was an opportunity to grow and improve. Mr. Collins, always patient, guided him with practical advice and encouraged him to think for himself. "Kevin," said Mr. Collins one day, while reviewing some documents, "don't be afraid to make mistakes. We all make them. What matters is what you learn from them." This phrase left its mark on Kevin, who allowed himself to be bolder in the decisions he made. He knew that he was there to learn and that over time, he would become better and better. Emma also remained by his side, offering constant support. One evening, they were sitting in the garden at home, where they used to chat after work and study. "You're doing so well," said Emma proudly. "I knew you'd stand out." Kevin smiled, still modest but grateful for her words. "Thank you, Emma. I don't know what I'd do without your support." Emma looked at him with a warm gaze. "You'd be doing exactly what you're doing now, Kevin, because it all comes from you." Emma's words encouraged him to keep going, even on the hardest days. He knew he wasn't alone, and that gave him the strength to keep doing his best. As the months went by, Kevin began to stand out more and more in the company. Richard and Mr. Collins noticed his growth and were impressed by his ability to adapt and learn quickly. Kevin, who had once seen himself as just a kid with no opportunities, was now beginning to see that his efforts were, in fact, opening doors to a promising future. One day, Richard called Kevin into his office for a private chat. "Kevin," he began, looking admiringly at the young man in front of him, "you've exceeded all expectations. I knew you had potential, but what you've done here so far is remarkable." Kevin was surprised, not knowing what to say. "Thank you, Mr. Richard. I'm just trying to do my best." Richard smiled, shaking his head. "And you are. In fact, I'm thinking of something bigger for you." Kevin was intrigued. "Something bigger?" Richard nodded. "Yes, I want you to start preparing to take on more responsibility. Not just in the internship, but in real projects. You're ready for the next step." Kevin was speechless for a moment, trying to process what Richard was saying. "I don't know what to say. This is more than I expected." "You don't have to say anything now," said Richard with a reassuring smile. "Just keep doing what you're doing, and know that I'm here to support you every step of the way." Kevin nodded, feeling a mixture of gratitude and excitement for what the future held. That evening, on his way home, Kevin sat with Tommy and Mrs. Martha, sharing the news. They, as always, encouraged him and showed how proud they were of him. "Kev," said Tommy with a mischievous grin, "I think you're going to be the boss one day." Kevin laughed, shaking his head. "I'm still a long way from that, Tommy, but who knows one day." And as they laughed and talked about the future, Kevin realized that he was actually building something bigger than he had ever imagined. He was surrounded by love, support, and new opportunities, and he knew that with this solid foundation, he could achieve anything. The journey of sacrifices and challenges had brought him this far, and now, with everything he had learned and achieved, Kevin felt he was just beginning to chart a bright path, not just for himself, but for his entire family. If you enjoyed this video and want to see more content like this, we have prepared the next video especially for you. Click here to watch